My wife asked for a divorce, and when it came time to decide who got what, I told my lawyer I wanted everything except our daughter, even when he begged me to fight and warned me I was making a mistake, because I was done. So in the courtroom I said, give it all to her, and the room went dead quiet as I signed everything over at the final hearing, while she sat there thinking she'd won until her own lawyer suddenly lost it. But let me rewind, because this didn't start in court, it started after 24 years of marriage, in February, on a freezing Ohio night in Franklin County, where I've spent 28 years as a building inspector, the kind of guy whose job is finding what's wrong behind walls that look fine, and at 2 a.m. I woke up thirsty, padded down the hall in my socks, and saw my wife Caroline hunched over her phone in the dark kitchen, blue light glowing, lavender face cream in the air from those reinvention Facebook groups she'd gotten obsessed with, and something about her posture felt off, like she was guarding the screen, and from the hallway I could read the messages, someone telling her they couldn't wait to see her new place, calling her unstoppable, saying once she was free of the dead weight the real Caroline could shine, dead weight being me, and she smiled at that. So I backed away, stared at myself in the mirror, 54 years old, grey at the temples, thinning hair, eyes worn down by years of piling problems, then lay awake until dawn after she slipped back into bed, phone face down, and instead of confronting her the next day, because I know panic just leads to denial and cheap cover-ups, I did what I always do when I find damage and started documenting, watching her over the next few weeks like a compromised structure, noting patterns and shifts, especially with the home staging business she'd started 10 months earlier, which was supposed to be temporary, easy money, just a few pieces of furniture here and there. Something I supported because that's what you do after 24 years. You compromise and tell yourself small things don't matter, except temporary became permanent. And first the forest green Afghan my mother crocheted before she died vanished. Then the brass floor lamp from a 2009 estate sale. Then my leather recliner from my 40th birthday. Then the dining chairs I'd repaired myself after Jade spilled orange soda on them. And every time I noticed, Caroline waved it off as being at a client's house and coming back soon. But soon never came, and the living room filled with gaps, empty corners and rearranged pictures hiding what was gone, until one Saturday, while Jade and I were out buying truck supplies, our good couch disappeared and was replaced by a cheap beige knockoff, and Jade, 15 and already sharp-eyed and stubborn like both of us, stood in the doorway saying the couch must have died, while Caroline breezed in with an iced coffee from the pricey place downtown, grinning and telling us the real couch was staged somewhere and this was fine for now, that we worried too much about things that didn't matter, and across that hollow room, Jade looked at me and I just shook my head. Don't. Not worth it, I said, and Jade pressed her lips together, turned, and went to her room without another word. But later that night she knocked on my bedroom door with her laptop open and said, Dad, I found something weird, and showed me that Mom had been selling furniture on Facebook Marketplace under a different name. Listings I immediately recognized as our furniture with prices that didn't match the numbers Caroline claimed clients were paying. A side hustle inside the side hustle. And when I asked how long it had been going on, Jade scrolled and said the oldest listing was 8 months ago. So I took a photo of the screen and added it to the folder I'd started keeping. And over time the garage filled with tagged furniture, wrapped lamps, and rolled rugs standing upright like they were lined up for inspection, forcing me to move my tools into one corner and then completely out into a $300 secondhand storage shed I bought off Craigslist. My own workspace displaced by throw pillows and accent tables. But it wasn't the furniture that really caught my attention, it was the bank statements. Because one evening while balancing the checkbook, something Caroline had stopped doing years ago, I noticed odd patterns. Money flowing out in strange chunks that didn't match normal spending. $600 here, $1,400 there. Charges from Columbus furniture wholesalers that didn't line up with what I saw in the garage. Deposits that should have been coming in from clients but weren't. Month after month more money leaving than returning. And then the college fund statement arrived on a Thursday in a thin envelope with official letterhead. The fund we'd started the month Jade was born back when we were young and hopeful. $30 a week at first. Then more as we could manage, birthday money, Christmas bonuses, tax refunds. 15 years of trying to make sure our daughter wouldn't drown in student loans the way we almost had. And the balance was $8,000 lower than it should have been. My first instinct being that it had to be a computer error until I saw the clean transaction line reading transfer out authorized by joint account holder. So the next day I called the investment company from my truck parked outside a condemned duplex I just failed for mold and electrical nightmares. and the representative calmly confirmed the transfer, authorized by Caroline Bowen 3 months earlier, and I sat there long after hanging up realizing $8,000 of our daughter's future had been spent on furniture destined for strangers' houses. Money Caroline had taken without a word. And that evening when I found her in the kitchen glued to her phone, I set the statement between us and said we needed to talk. Only for her to glance at it and say it was temporary. The business needed cash to scale, she'd pay it back. And when I reminded her it was Jade's 529, she shrugged and said technically it was our money and Jade would be fine. Kids figure it out, and that's what student loans are for. Then turned back to her phone like the conversation was over. And standing later in the dim garage light holding that folded statement, I finally understood something I should have years earlier. That Caroline wasn't building a business. She was building an exit strategy and stripping our life for parts to fund it. So I spent the next 6 weeks building a file, not out of revenge, but because that's what I do after 28 years of writing reports that hold up to lawyers and insurance adjusters, meticulously filing bank statements, highlighting every transfer in yellow, cross-referencing withdrawals against garage inventory, watching the math refuse to add up as money bled into somewhere I couldn't see until I noticed a recurring charge on our joint credit card I'd somehow missed before. $180 a month to a storage facility on the east side of town near the industrial parks the city hides from the highway. So one afternoon after a site inspection I drove past it. A gray cinder block building behind a rusted fence with security cameras pointed at nothing, probably dead for years, photographed it, noted the date, time, and address, and added it to the folder. And the real break finally came from Tony Mendes, my best friend since high school, the guy I'd survived from disasters with, stood beside as best man, and sat next to at his wife's funeral 3 years ago when cancer took her too fast. The CPA who spent 3 decades keeping people from being eaten alive by the IRS and their own financial stupidity, and on one of our every other Thursday poker nights in his basement over cold pizza and cards. Just the two of us now that everyone else had drifted away or fallen apart. I told him everything. It was the same basement where we'd watched our kids grow up, celebrated promotions, and complained about setbacks, and Tony listened without interrupting, which is how you know he's taking something seriously. And when I finished he set his cards down, leaned back, and asked if I wanted his professional opinion, which of course was why I was there, and he told me flat out that Caroline was either terrible at business or hiding money somewhere, probably both, pointing out that the storage unit was interesting because running inventory through there without documentation is a tax issue, and if money isn't showing up in accounts I can see, then it's going somewhere I can't. And when I asked if he could help me figure out where, he smiled like a guy who'd seen this exact mess before and knew how it usually ended, explaining he could show me what to look for and exactly which paperwork to pull that she'd never think to hide because most people don't know what auditors actually care about. Then spent 2 hours teaching me how to read financial trails, which statements trigger automatic records, which discrepancies matter to courts and which are just sloppy bookkeeping, telling me the storage unit was my smoking gun and that she was probably running inventory through it off the books, cash deals, and trades with other stages that look normal until the IRS takes interest. And when I asked how I could prove any of that without access to her records, he said I didn't have to prove it. Just document what I could see and let her explain what she couldn't. Then sketched a diagram on a yellow legal pad showing how business liability works in a divorce, explaining that sole ownership also means sole responsibility for every debt, obligation, and tax consequence. Something most people don't think about, and that her lawyer wouldn't bother explaining because lawyers tell clients what they want to hear. And Monica would back it up because Monica's never been wrong in her life. And when I asked about the Facebook Marketplace account under a fake name, his eyebrows shot up as he called it tax evasion. Unreported income that compounds into a bigger problem every year. Scribbling numbers on a napkin and estimating 25 to 30 grand in just 8 months. Serious penalties if it kept going, and maybe fraud charges if the IRS wanted to make an example. Sliding the napkin across the table and telling me I didn't have to prove any of it. Just make sure she owned it when the question started, and as I pocketed the napkin and studied his diagram the logic clicked. Because you can't trick someone into signing something that's properly disclosed, but you can let them trick themselves. And as I was leaving, Tony said he knew where this was going and asked what the play was. Drag her to court or fight for every dollar. And after weeks of thinking, the answer came out simple and backwards, that I was going to let her have exactly what she was asking for, which made him raise an eyebrow and say that sounded like losing, only if you don't read the fine print. Because Caroline asked for a divorce on a Sunday morning over breakfast like she was reading a grocery list, with her sister Monica sitting there too, 3 years younger, twice divorced, somehow walking away from both marriages with the other guy's money and no blame, collecting alimony like a hobby and looking at me like something stuck to the bottom of her shoe, as Caroline calmly said she wanted. The house, both vehicles, the business assets in full, and a 50-50 split of the retirement account. And I took my time sipping coffee, letting the silence stretch until Monica squirmed, before asking about Jade, which Caroline waved off saying I could have custody because she didn't have time for a teenager while her business was taking off. Monica nodding along and adding that Jade was at a difficult age anyway, moody and dramatic, and Caroline shouldn't have to deal with that on top of everything else, and I understood perfectly, because to them our daughter wasn't worth fighting for. She was just another piece of furniture that didn't fit Caroline's new look. That's when I noticed Jade standing in the hallway, so quiet I hadn't even heard her come down the stairs, her face carefully blank in that way she got when she was trying not to show how badly something hurt. And she'd heard everything, every word, and she said, flat and calm, "Wow, Mom, really feeling the love here?" While Caroline rolled her eyes and said not to be dramatic, that this wasn't about her, and Jade answered, "No, I guess it isn't," before walking out the front door, the soft click of it closing somehow worse than any slam, and I looked at Caroline and Monica, two women who had clearly spent weeks rehearsing this moment, planning their victory and dividing up the winnings before the fight even started, and I said, "Okay," which made Monica blink and ask what I meant, and I repeated it, "Okay. She can have it, the house, the cars, the business," then stood up and carried my coffee mug to the sink, taking my time and saying I'd call a lawyer tomorrow, while the silence behind me stretched thick and heavy as they recalculated, trying to find the trap because nobody just gives up like that, until Caroline finally said it was unexpectedly reasonable, and I turned and smiled and told her I was a reasonable guy. Then hired Wallace Braddock on Tony's recommendation, a 62-year-old man who looked like someone's favorite grandfather but had the instincts of a shark, with 35 years of family law in Franklin County and every trick memorized because he'd written half of them himself. And we met in his cluttered office above a dry cleaner that smelled like cleaning solvents and old paper, legal books lining every wall and files covering every surface, where he listened, reviewed my documentation without comment, and finally asked if I really wanted to give her almost everything she wanted. And when he asked me to explain the almost, I laid it out. Caroline wanted sole ownership of the staging business and all its assets. Fine, every lamp, throw pillow, and questionable financial decision was hers. She wanted the house, also fine but with conditions. She wanted the retirement account split 50-50, and that was where I drew the line because I had 28 years in my pension and she had maybe 5 years of scattered IRA contributions, most of which she'd already raided for inventory, and any judge would see the math didn't work, and Braddock nodded and asked what else. And I told him I wanted my truck, my tools, full custody of Jade with child support from Caroline since I'd be the primary parent, and the $8,000 she took from Jade's 529 offset against her share of the home equity, non-negotiable, which he noted as an improper withdrawal from an educational account and said we could frame it as reimbursement to make it easier for a judge to approve. And when he asked about the Facebook Marketplace sales and I showed him Jade's screenshots, his eyes sharpened as he scrolled and called it gold. Unreported income under a fake name that could turn into fraud charges during an IRS inquiry. Then handed the phone back and said we wouldn't mention it directly, just make sure all business records were included so auditors could find the gaps themselves. And when I said she could keep the house only if a clause was locked down tight, requiring her to refinance within 90 days to remove my name from the mortgage or sell with no extensions, he called it standard practice and asked about her credit, which I told him was trashed with unpaid vendor debt, mixed accounts, and underreported income across at least 2 tax years according to Tony, all of which would become her problem alone once she took sole ownership. And Braddock tapped his pen and noted that her attorney, Camila Hull, was young, aggressive, impatient, and likely to want the whole thing settled fast to avoid prolonged discovery. They'll push for expedited mediation, Braddock said, and when I asked if they'd do forensic accounting he shook his head and said he'd suggest it was unnecessary given how cooperative we were being. That Hull would advise her client to skip the deep dive to save money and time. Caroline would agree because she's impatient and Monica keeps whispering that there's hidden money somewhere. And if they actually read the appendices, he smiled, not warmly, because Holt bills hourly and would skim signature pages and trust we were just as eager to settle as they were, while the detailed financial exhibits sat in Appendix C through F, properly labeled, fully disclosed, completely legal, and if they chose not to read 200 pages of documentation that was on them, because the settlement locks in before the final hearing, signatures get collected at mediation as standard procedure. And the final hearing is where the judge reviews everything, confirms both parties understand, and enters the agreement into the official record, which is when all attached exhibits become permanent, officially acknowledged, and that's when I understood that mediation was the trap and the courtroom was the reveal, that I wasn't giving her the business but handing her a bomb with the timer already running. And Caroline didn't go quietly, I'll give her that. Because with Monica in her ear and her pride on the line, she turned dangerous fast. The first month becoming a blur of motions as Camila fired off demands like she was paid by the word, asset inventories, disclosures, depositions scheduled and rescheduled again. All designed to uncover the hidden fortune Monica had convinced Caroline I was hoarding. Except there was no fortune. Just a guy who'd worked the same job for 28 years and watched his wife spend everything else, while Monica coached from the sidelines, telling anyone who'd listen that I had secret accounts and the real Garrett was finally being exposed. And through it all, Jade stayed with me in the small 2-bedroom apartment with thin walls and a parking lot view, where I'd enrolled her in a new high school so she wouldn't have to bounce between parents or deal with the gossip, and we built quiet routines, pancakes on Saturdays, spaghetti on Wednesdays from YouTube recipes, barely talking about her mother because we didn't need to, until April when Caroline escalated by filing an emergency motion accusing me of wasting marital assets, claiming I'd sold my old 16-foot aluminum fishing boat, the one I bought used in 2011 for $2,000 and spent more fixing than it was ever worth, which I'd sold for $2,800 to cover the apartment deposit and first month's rent. And she insisted it was worth $15,000 and demanded I explain the missing 12, apparently based on Monica finding a pristine listing online and deciding my rusted-out patched hull tub was the same, a claim the judge dismantled in 20 minutes when Braddock submitted the original receipt, repair invoices exceeding the purchase price, the actual sale listing, and photos showing rust and patches. But that wasn't the end, because a week later someone filed an anonymous complaint to the county ethics hotline accusing me of taking bribes to pass inspections, specific enough to trigger a formal investigation and vague enough to force a review of 3 years of my work, putting me on administrative leave for 2 weeks while strangers combed my records and found nothing because there was nothing, and when I was reinstated my supervisor told me the complaint was specific, named 3 properties, and whoever filed it either did their homework or had access to my calendar, raising an eyebrow and saying it was permanently in my file even though it was unfounded, and Braddock couldn't prove it was Monica but the timing was too perfect. And then Monica showed up at my apartment while I was at work, Jade home alone doing homework, watching through the peephole as her aunt tried doors and windows, rattled handles, peered inside, took photos, 20 minutes of attempted entry all caught on security cameras, never getting in, and Jade told me that night. But she really tried, Jade told me, even tried your truck, which was locked, obviously, but she still tried, and when I asked if she'd called the police Jade shook her head and said she thought about it, but figured the security footage of her aunt trying to break in might be more useful than getting her arrested before she could really embarrass herself. And I looked at my daughter, this 15-year-old kid who'd somehow learned to think 3 moves ahead while her parents' lives were falling apart around her, and asked when she got so smart, and she shrugged and said she had to pick it up somewhere and it definitely wasn't from her mom's side. So I sent the footage to Braddock the next morning and he added it to a file that was getting thicker every week, calling it leverage and reminding me that breaking and entering is criminal and we'd save it for when we needed it, and 3 weeks later Camila called to schedule settlement mediation. Fast, Caroline wanted it faster, and just like Braddock predicted they waived forensic accounting, claiming the expense and delay weren't necessary given how cooperative discovery had been. So mediation happened in late May and Caroline showed up dressed for war, all sharp angles and aggressive confidence, new suit, new haircut, new attitude that said she'd already won, while Monica sat against the wall in a visitor chair scrolling her phone like she had somewhere better to be. And before we started Monica leaned over and said loud enough for me to hear that Caroline needed to make sure she got the retirement accounts because that's where I'd stashed the real money. Caroline nodding and saying Camila promised they'd get at least half, having no idea what half of nothing looked like, and the mediator ran through the standard disclaimers while no one really listened, Camila flipping through the settlement agreement with the speed of someone already celebrating, barely reading as she went, sole ownership of the business and all inventory, receivables, payables, and obligations to Caroline, the house to Caroline with the 90-day refinance clause buried deep in paragraph 4-7 of 63, retirement accounts split 82-18 in my favor, full custody of Jade to me with minimal child support. Caroline initialing and signing exactly where she was told without a single question, confident and careless, until Camila announced they were ready to finalize. Braddock calmly noting that Financial Exhibits Appendix C through F were attached with 214 pages of documentation. Camila waving it off, saying they'd reviewed the disclosures, which they hadn't, and after I signed, the mediator stamped it executed and set the final hearing for June 14th. Caroline smiling at me across the table while I smiled back, knowing what sat in those appendices. And at the courtroom she sat across from me, still dressed for war. Monica front row ready to watch the victory. Judge Warren reviewing the paperwork and asking if we both understood the agreement. Caroline and I answering yes. Then Braddock standing to note for the record that appendices C through F were incorporated into the agreement detailing the business assets Caroline was taking sole ownership of. Judge Warren turning to Camila and asking if she'd reviewed those exhibits with her client before signing, the question hanging there because she couldn't answer without lying or admitting failure, her face draining as she stumbled through an answer about summaries and acknowledgements. The judge cutting in and asking again, yes or no, and Camila stuck, unable to say either. Finally saying the waiver of forensic accounting was mutual to move things along, while everyone in that room understood exactly what had just happened. Mrs. Bowen, the judge said, cutting in as he turned to Caroline, are you aware that the business assets you're assuming include outstanding vendor obligations totaling $47,000? And Caroline froze and said what? Just as he continued that there were also storage facility fines of approximately $6,000. Camila Hull grabbing her copy of the settlement and flipping frantically to the appendices she hadn't bothered to read, her face draining of color as she found them. Starting to speak before the judge added that the exhibits also included documentation suggesting unreported business income across multiple tax years that could warrant IRS inquiry, which sent Monica to her feet in the gallery shouting fraud and entrapment until the judge told her to sit down because she wasn't a party to the proceedings, and Monica did, while Caroline turned on her lawyer, voice climbing as she said, you told me everything was fine. You said we didn't need forensic accounting. And Camila answered in a strained voice that the appendices were extensive and they relied on opposing counsel's representations and made a judgment call to move faster, snapping that this wasn't what they agreed to before catching herself too late. A lawyer losing control on the record, apologizing as Judge Warren shut her down cold, reminding her she waived forensic review and signed acknowledgement of disclosure, while Braddock calmly stated the appendices were fully disclosed and properly labeled with a signed waiver on file. The judge then asking Camila directly whether she advised her client to waive detailed review and whether her client acknowledged sole ownership and liability. Camila answering yes but stumbling that they didn't realize, only to be cut off as the judge stated the disclosure was complete and the time to realize was before signing. Caroline's voice breaking as she accused me of knowing and letting her, and I answered that everything was disclosed in the appendices she acknowledged receiving, that her lawyer advised skipping review and she agreed because she wanted sole ownership and got it. Judge Warren folding his hands and entering the settlement into the record, noting the exhibits may warrant review by authorities and reminding Caroline she assumed sole liability and must refinance within 90 days or sell, asking if she understood as she looked sick and Monica gripped the railing, finally whispering yes, the gavel falling, Camila already packing her things while Caroline sat frozen as Monica rushed forward threatening appeals and lawsuits until the judge warned her again. The bailiff stepping closer. Braddock pleasantly noting that failure to read disclosed documents isn't grounds for appeal but malpractice, and that was a discussion Caroline should have with her attorney, not us. And as I stood and straightened my jacket I found Jade waiting in the hallway, sitting on a bench scrolling her phone like it was any other day, asking how it went and me telling her mother got everything she wanted. Jade studying my face before smiling slowly and saying that bad for her, and I said yeah, that bad, and we walked to my truck together, legally and officially mine. Monica's muffled fury echoing behind us as I opened the passenger door. Jade buckled in and looked at me with something I hadn't seen in months. Hope, saying she thought we came out ahead, and when I told her we also got her $8,000 back, offset against equity and written into the decree, that her $529 was whole again. She stared at me and then laughed. A real laugh, the first I had heard from her in months, and she called me an absolute legend as the aftermath unfolded month by month. Caroline could not refinance the house, her credit wrecked by business debt, late vendor payments, and collection actions stacking up, and she went to 3 different mortgage brokers who all ran her credit and told her no thanks, because the mortgage company did not care about explanations, promises, Or the story Monica helped her craft about how none of it was really her fault. On day 87 she tried calling me and left a voicemail asking if we could work something out, extend the deadline, figure something out, and I did not call back. Then on day 89 Braddock filed the petition. The court ordered the sale. She had 30 days to list, and she sold in a soft market in a rush to the first buyer who made an offer. And after the mortgage payoff, the outstanding liens, the property taxes she had let slide, the $8,000 offset for Jade's 529, and the agent's commission, she walked away with barely enough for first and last month's rent on an apartment in a neighborhood she used to drive through with her doors locked. The house she wanted so badly, the house she stripped our home to get, belonging to strangers within 4 months of the final hearing. The storage facility terminated her lease after a fire marshal inspection found multiple violations including commercial inventory in a space not rated for commercial use, blocked fire exits, and not enough sprinklers, and the fines alone would have been brutal. But worse than that, most of her remaining inventory was seized by creditors before she could sell it off. Furniture she spent our money on. Furniture meant to be the foundation of her empire, hauled away in trucks by people she owed. And the staging business that was supposed to fund her new life collapsed in 3 months. Her last client, a realtor named Rix, who had used her twice before and called me out of the blue one afternoon asking if I knew where Caroline was because she took a $5,000 deposit for a staging job and never showed up, ghosted him completely. And I told him I was not her keeper anymore, but he might want to talk to a lawyer. Because word gets around in tight-knit industries and people talk, and what they were saying about Caroline was not flattering. Then the IRS letters started arriving, which Caroline mentioned to Jade during one of their rare phone calls. Notices about unreported income and requests for documentation she could not provide because her records were a disaster, and she asked if I knew any accountants who would work cheap, which Jade told me over Wednesday spaghetti. And I told her I did not, because the unreported income, questionable deductions, and mixed-up accounts made everything impossible to untangle without professional help she could not afford. Monica let Caroline move into her guest room, which lasted 6 weeks before the screaming started, and I did not gloat but felt peace when I heard Caroline finally started looking for a real job with a regular paycheck, while Jade finished sophomore year at her new school with a 3.6 GPA. Made the honor roll for the first time since middle school. We kept making pancakes on Saturday mornings. The apartment eventually got a new stove and the pancakes turned out better. And one evening 8 months after the hearing, Jade looked up from her homework and asked if I thought her mom got it yet. That she lost. And I thought about the house now owned by strangers. The business that was supposed to set her free reduced to debt and regret. The daughter she dismissed as a complication now thriving without her. And I told Jade I did not think she would ever get it because that is how people like her mother work. They blame everyone else when it falls apart. And sometimes the best thing you can do is step back and let people have exactly what they asked for because they usually do not want it once they get it. And guys, we are so close to hitting 100,000 subscribers on this channel. So if you are not subscribed, please consider subscribing because it really helps us reach that 100,000 mark. And thanks for making this dream come true.